Bonsoir. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenue. Welcome to tonight's talk. My name's Peter Kaufman. I'm a member of Heritage Ottawa's Lecture Series Committee, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight and very pleased to welcome our speaker, Andrew Waldron. Andrew's talk will explore the how and why of a major and ongoing conservation project in Ottawa. And it's even more than usually timely right now because of the challenge faced by municipalities across Ontario as they grapple with the fallout from the provincial government's Bill 23, known as the More Homes Built Faster Act, which you may be familiar with. I also want to give some thanks. Our lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrix Holdings Incorporated and Sandy Smallwood. Andrix has been a faithful sponsor of these free lectures, as well as our walks and some of our publications, and we're very grateful to both of them. And we're also very grateful for an operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. I also want to say a word about membership. As we approach the end of our financial year this month, we're asking you to consider supporting Heritage Ottawa by becoming a member, or by renewing your membership if you have been a member, or by making a donation. A membership does go a long way towards strengthening our credibility and adding legitimacy to our voice. Getting a membership is really the simplest way to have a real, measurable impact on heritage conservation in Ottawa, and donations help us offer programming such as this for free. And right now, your support is more important than ever. It's only by having people, the public, you behind us, that we can continue to be heard as we respond to challenging issues such as Bill 23, which I mentioned, and the federal government's Bill C-23 regarding the Historic Places of Canada Act. Your help does make a difference. And also being a member of Heritage Ottawa connects you with a really agreeable community of like-minded people who are interested in and care about and are often passionate about our history, our heritage, and our built heritage, and the quality of the built environment in this city. So if you're already a member or have made a donation, we extend our heartfelt thanks. If you're not and are considering it, I would urge you to move ahead. It's very simple. Go to our membership page on the website, a click of the mouse and a credit card, and you're a member of this community. So it's now a real pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Andrew Waldron. And it's a real pleasure, partly because Andrew has actually been a close colleague and a close friend of mine for many years. He's had an extraordinarily accomplished and varied career in the worlds of heritage and architectural history. And so to make sure I don't actually miss anything, I'm actually going to read his bio. For over 25 years, Andrew has been in the field of heritage conservation. Most recently, he has been appointed as Executive Director, Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, the first person to hold this new post. Previously, he was, previously, he was the National Heritage Conservation Manager at BGIS, a leading provider of real estate management services. He is a former Parks Canada Superintendent, Canadian Registrar of Historic Places, and manager of the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office. Over the years, he has been president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada, and he helped to found the National Historic Sites Alliance of Canada, a nonprofit organization of nationally significant historic sites. He has written and presented on many topics, and is the author of Exploring the Capital, an architectural guide to the Ottawa-Gatineau region. Andrew, I hear that's quite good. He is an adjunct professor and colleague of mine at Carleton University in the History and Theory of Architecture program, and an instructor in the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, also at Carleton. As a consultant through his firm, Saventurier, he has worked on a range of conservation projects. His first love is Canadian architectural history, and he's specialized in researching modern architecture in Canada. He participates in his community as a co-chair of his local heritage committee. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and speak to us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for the introductions, Peter. It's a real joy to be here at Heritage Ottawa. I've been listening to the talks over the pandemic for quite a few years now, and we always enjoy them. What I want to begin with is just a few points before I present to you a recorded video of my presentation. I thought that would be an appropriate way to do this. I want you to look at a few of these ideas while you're listening to the presentation, but also consider these ideas. And I also want to acknowledge one of my heroes of my career. And I'm going to share this with you. To begin, I want you to see these two ideas. They're Japanese ideas. One's called kintsugi, and the other is called okoshishin. And kintsugi is the idea of repairing things and the beauty in repairing things. So this is the concept of, you may have things that are being neglected, but once you start to conserve them, they actually have an inherent beauty in that restoration work. This is a concept that's been around for 1,000 years, but it's something that we tend to not appreciate. And the second concept is okoshishin, which is essentially learning from history. So there is not as a strong historical awareness out there. We know that, but as heritage conservationists and historians and so on, we appreciate it. But there's still a concept of, or an idea that we must be, we must demolish things and replace them and so on. So consider these two ideas as you hear the presentation. The second concept that I want to present is the notion of existing buildings versus heritage buildings. And this is something that is becoming more and more important as we talk about heritage conservation. Existing buildings really relate to the future of our planet, the sustainability of our planet. You can read some quotes here, but essentially it is switching away from the idea that we have a small number of designated buildings to a full idea that we must preserve existing structures. We don't have the luxury anymore of essentially demolishing buildings. To make a point, in Canada, very few buildings are actually designated heritage buildings. So only about 4% is my estimate from all my years of work in the federal government. There are very few federal heritage buildings. Peter just mentioned the Bill C-23. It would only designate a few of the buildings in Canada under that protective law. What we really are looking for is a new era of heritage conservation and preserving existing buildings. And that may mean more rehabilitation. It may mean adapting them to other uses, deconstructing them. There's a lot of concepts there that are moving heritage conservation away from the designation world, commemoration world, into a broader stroke of maintenance in society. So I also want to just give an acknowledgement to a very special researcher, historian. He was an architect, an architectural historian, who I think is important in looking back at his work as I have presented in my recording. This is Peter Collins. And Peter Collins wrote a seminal book called The Changing Ideals of Modern Architecture. And for any of you that haven't read this book, it was published in the 60s, but it's an overlooked piece of Canadian architectural history that analyzes in a very eloquent way the history of modern architecture. And so for anyone out there who doesn't have a copy of it and wants to enjoy a very interesting book, Changing Ideals in Modern Architecture is very important. And it was very influential at the time. Peter Collins was a professor at McGill. So with that, I'm going to present the video of the presentation. And then at the end, I will field questions when Peter comes back on, and we can have a very fruitful discussion on the Federal Studies Center. Good evening. This is a story about a campus that has remained mothballed for years, after being a Catholic campus and a federal study center. This evening, we're going to walk through the past, present, and future of what was once known as the Campanile. I'm going to break the presentation into three parts, a trinity, if you will, for you to better understand this historic place. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Heritage Ottawa for inviting me to speak. And as with any presentation, there are many people who are behind this talk. Tim Murray, the principal architect of the campus, Library and Archives Canada, the archivist there, Denise Trottier, the Gérald Trottier's daughter, the city's heritage planning team, including Louise Juarez, Canada Lands Company and their consultative teams, and of course residences of Alta Vista and Guildwood Estates. I want to walk through this presentation using three sections. First, the context and history of the campus. Second, the designation process and what was to be done with the property. And third, to present the future of the property and consider the demonstration of infill at a historic place. First, the context and history of the campus. We are living on Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. At the time of contact with European arrivals, there were relations between different Anishinaabe confederacies, with Mississaugas and Algonquins often meeting here with the Odawa. This was a rich and varied region of cultures close to Iroquois and Huron territories, all interacting together. By the 1850s, the land we're interested in was owned by George Heron, who had bought the property off of Bradish Billings. Eventually, the road to the farm became the Heron Road. Jump another century, and the City of Ottawa expropriated part of the township for future suburban development. Before expropriation, as you can see from 1948, little development had jumped the Rideau River. Alta Vista sets the post-war pattern of typical large properties with single-unit homes, mostly underwritten by the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and developed by the infamous Robert Campo. Rapidly, the area was populated, schools, churches, and shopping plazas were built. And by the early 1960s, Bernie Garon, who had bought the Guildwood properties with anticipation of opening it up to his housing development company. So essentially, two businessmen led much of the profitable development in the area until the 1970s. The Catholic Church's presence in the area was strong in the mid-1950s. There were several new parish churches, a new seminary on Kilbourne completed in 1957, and the initial development of the new Notre Dame campus with the completion of a new separate primary school, Queen of the Angels, busing in kids from Carleton Heights. All of this development was by different orders. The Sisters of the Congregation of Notre Dame vacated their 1870s convent and school on Gloucester Street after being sold to the Reichman brothers, Olympia and York, for development of the 26-story Place Belle Canada designed by Bregman and Mann. At the time, it made sense for the Oblates and the Sisters to join forces rather than building two different schools and the new convent. St. Patrick's would drop its proposed school off on nearby Kilbourne, and the potential Notre Dame High School along Alta Vista would also be dropped in favor of moving it to the campus. This consolidation would hold for a decade. It was as the diminishing fortunes of the congregation and separate school board that eventually led to the demise of the campus in 1973, with some suggesting demolition and sale of the property to recoup debts. St. Pat's remained on the campus until it moved to the French public school, Charlevoix, in 1993. There are, though, still schools open on the property. So in the late 1950s, Ottawa there was a strong Catholic presence in the suburbs, and it would be rejuvenating itself under Vatican II in the early 1960s, which would be expressed in the new convent's design. So to understand the impressive design, a $4 million project at the time, other changes in post-war society would push the church to respond in the 1960s with mixed success. Since the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, modernity was pushing the boundaries of social mores in suburban North America. Where there was an outward image of conservative culture, the 1950s was a brew of underlying social pressures. On the one hand, the nuclear family, the masculine world, the traumatized repression, and the forced conformity, the racism, and consumerism. But on the other hand, there was popular culture, the hedonism of Elvis's gyrations, teen screams, and liberations would foreshadow the coming boomer generation of the 1960s. The welfare state was also beginning to be implemented, but not to the extent of European and Scandinavian states, more so though than the United States. Our absolute poverty levels dropped significantly, and it was a time of great wealth, especially since the pre-war depression. The consequence of the immense wealth produced in the 1950s remains with us today, 60 years later. The patterns of our lives in Ottawa remain essentially the same as they were in the 1950s. Low density neighborhoods, private rather than public transportation, all by cars, completely decentralized with the largest per capita carbon footprint on the planet. The suburbs were built for private wealth and at first relatively low taxes, though these would increase as the suburban model expanded, with consequences we feel today. We have more cars on the road than ever. Where there was one family car in a driveway in the 1950s, there are now 3. We travel more times per year on planes. We vacation internationally. Our society is essentially based on a carbon economy that remains basically unchanged, at least for now. Much of our behavior comes from the expectation that we will have a lifestyle that is highly consumptive and based on the modernist planning principles of the 1950s. There are some potential changes to the model, but it's a hard pill to swallow while we continue to use our wealth for consumption. And this all began in the 1950s. The idea was to have a society that was wealthy at the expense of natural capital. It was a child-centric world focused on offering a leisure life for a whole generation. The aesthetic element of this post-war culture was the embrace of modern avant-garde architecture of the early 20th century. This is now a very familiar narrative. The great male architects become the genius architects of the largest building boom in the history of the world by creating a rational or objectivist architecture and planning model to develop modern society. And this was the case in Ottawa from the late 1940s onwards. Our famous Monsieur Jacques Grébert introduced our decentralized version of the modern planning model. He introduced car culture, removed the trains, decentralized the offices, encouraged the removal of slums, created the grand and monumental buildings for the National Capital Region. His plan was largely implemented until it was abandoned in the early 1970s. The suburban campuses and moving public servants from the core on daily public transit to cross-city commuting remains with us. The ex-urban communities are a familiar example of this. So, on Friday, March 14th, 1964, the architect Tim Murray unveiled our project. It would be an ambitious $4 million campus on a 21-acre site and include 2 high schools, a gym, auditorium, student union building, residence, cafeteria, chapel, convent, and a novitiate. When opened 2 years later, the campus was an impressive and sensitive complex of buildings responding to history and historicism, placemaking, and spiritual dimensions. It was not like the typical modernist architecture of Ottawa, nor was it working with a traditional Catholic version of modernism. Ottawa had brought an internationalism in the context of Ottawa's landscape. Hart Massey's house on Mackay Lake, the new City Hall on Green Island, or the creation of the quadrangle at Carleton University on the Rideau Canal, for example. These buildings had similar modernist principles, accentuating the grid, expressing the structure, independence from the ground. All elements of these architects came from their teachers, especially via the Bauhaus and Le Corbusier. But by the early 1960s, there was clearly a shift occurring in how modern architecture could respond to history, society, but through modern materials and modern forms. The ancient campanile, a freestanding bell tower, harkens back to the earliest Christian architecture and its call to worship. This is used by Murray at the entrance of the campus and surrounded by a sunken garden. While non-functional, it is a symbol of the campus, and the campus was eventually named the Campanile rather than Notre Dame Convent. Tim Murray, a young Irish architect who had studied at University College in Dublin and at Liverpool, was to go to Iraq in 1957, but ended up arriving in Canada to work for the Department of Public Works. With George Beamy, he started Beamy and Murray in 1959, finishing St. Basil's Church. He then went into partnership with his brother, Pat Murray, in 1961, and they blossomed as a firm both nationally and internationally. We'll see triads throughout the original concept. In terms of use, a residential, an academic, and public area. There would be 3 circulation systems along the same lines. Roads and parking were outside of the scheme, and similar to Carleton, there were underground passages, but these ones were lit by deep wells. There's a carefulness of color, texture, and details of landscaping that have been combined using 3 major materials, again 3, red brick, concrete, and copper. The chapel is intended to be the center focus of the campus along the main axis. And it was described at the time as a visual expression of a new educational atmosphere, less rigid, less obtrusive supervision, wider cooperation. When open, the Campanile, as it was then called, was uniquely a large campus complex in the suburbs with some students staying in residence there. It contrasted the general monumental federal buildings that were being built all over suburban Ottawa, especially on Confederation Heights. As Reverend Gordon Irving said when it opened, the combination of schools meant that, quote, while coeducation poses threats, it also offers advantages for social development. The triad or trinity pattern underlying the design forms an interesting interplay between asymmetrical play of figure and ground. There was a clarity and consistency to the 3 materials of choice, concrete, red brick, and copper, imparting a warmth to each structure. The initial intention was to build one massive structure, but Murray approached the campus as a series of outdoor enclosed rooms. He was trying to resolve how to approach this dispersed and open suburban space with a place that had a grounded relationship with its people. Murray took Sister Saint David Marie and other nuns to recently completed campus buildings he thought might inspire the sisters and their vision for the campus. They saw Le Corbusier's Visual Arts Center, completed a year before at Harvard, providing demonstration of Corbusian tenets of circulation and motion through buildings and the potentials of concrete forms unlike anything seen in Ottawa at the time. He introduced them to the work of Paul Rudolph, where Rudolph's early use of underpassages, expressive staircases, and his move away from Gropius to developing modern Gothic elements integrated with an eclectic use of concrete and brickwork. And you can see Murray exploring the ideas that he saw in the early works of Rudolph, the floating base, projecting buttresses or pilasters, and grounding windows, working through indirect natural light below the surface. And as I've presented in other talks, Murray and Murray's Morisset Library from 1972 is indebted to the early brutalist work of the A&A building, the Arts and Architecture building at Yale, which Rudolph designed in 1962 with his own influence of both Wright's Larkin building in Buffalo and Le Corbusier's later work. By the time that the convent campus began to be realized in 1963, Murray had developed a preliminary concept, cellular in organization, yet symmetrical in plan. There would be a series of inward-looking quadrangles with pedestrians in mind, the creation of closed-off spaces with scaped frames, brought, as Barbara Lambert, if you know her, she was one of the first women graduates of the School of Architecture at McGill in 1943. She was married to Martin Lambert, the architect in Ottawa, and she was the sister of the Dominion sculptor Eleanor Mill. And she described the campus wonderfully as an intimate, yet with a dignified atmosphere. So good architecture introduces underlying compositions that unify. There are tripartite facades in the buildings with proportional ratios to the datum lines. There are allusions to medieval architecture using the scuppers along the cornice. A simple running bond brickwork throughout the use of brick screens, which would be used again and again, and I'd love to see them designed and used in the proposed design. There were gateways and simple arches used to convey transitions between spaces. The landscape, which was designed by Peter Coe, who was for the most part of his career a landscape architect at Public Works, brought a simple and nuanced naturalism to the quadrangles and terraces. He had studied at Rhode Island School of Design in the early 1960s. So ignoring the ink spills that you see, Murray began to bring together all these ideas into a cohesive whole, refining each building into a simple yet modern complex. Sister Sainte Marie David, she was the liaison between the nuns, the order, and the architect, and she fought forcefully for acceptance of Murray's architectural ideas. As already said, the intention was a visual expression of a new educational atmosphere, less rigid, less obtrusive supervision, and wider cooperation. It did take some time for Murray to resolve parts of the campus. Here's an early idea of the theater. He explored a theater in the round with nods to the Shakespearean Globe Theater. It eventually mimicked the chapel form of raised base brick walls with a sunken interior and copper roofing, but in an octagonal form. This allowed for a lower building near the entrance to the campus. And it eventually seated 400 with, of course, a thrust stage. Using black asbestos paneling for acoustics with pattern brick, there was plastered concrete walls and some hardwood used throughout the theater space. It created a warm glow, an intimate setting. And of course, this mysterious space would rarely be seen by the public while in the hands of the government, even though theater troupes knew about it and wished they could use it in the evenings when the public servants were using it. The central chapel drew the eye from the entrance along that axis up to an expressive modern structure right in the center of the campanile. It was set further inside the quadrangle, away from Heron Road, and responded essentially to the Second Vatican's discussions that were being held in Rome that year, in 1963. Its concrete form, wrapped in copper, alludes to, I would consider and described at the time, as a sort of Mesoamerican offset temple form, heavier than other buildings, with these high brick walls on the exterior. The chapel incorporated new church liturgy into the design, and it was Murray's architectural drama that created such an impressive work, especially in terms of lighting, materials, and the subtle textural contrast. The space is deconsecrated and could easily be restored with an ecumenical role. Indeed, oddly enough, right now, the nearby Buddhist temple is trying to raise funds to build a new temple along Heron Road. Who knows? It was a major undertaking of concrete formwork at the time. Murray used his maquette actually to develop the lighting effects. The floating roof allows for a flat roof to collect rain and snow, which reflected light into the interior walls from below. The glazing created a backlighting that worked along with artificial lighting behind these brick screens. There was also once terracotta Stations of the Cross designed by Sister Saint-Gilbert of Montreal, who had a fine art degree from Columbia University. And there was a small, of course, old organ that was installed in the back corner. The artificial lighting that was used inside behind the brick screens but brought out these really interesting lighting patterns into the nave. And Murray was interested in an expression of form and function from the interior to the exterior, particularly using the sanctuary's monumental form on its exterior. And you can see this in the wonderful shot that Mark Fowler did in 2017. Now, I have some comparatives here. Jim Strutt's Trinity United Church from 1962 was perhaps a predecessor to Murray's use of copper on the roof. And while Jim Strutt is likely aware of what Walter Nesch was doing at the Air Cadets Academy Chapel in Colorado, which was built the same year, 1962, although it was designed in aluminum and not of course, the copper that we see all over Ottawa. So there is a connection here. The light shaft, Murray had some particular challenges with this, and he was trying to figure out how to bring an impressive drama down into the chapel. And of course, it was accentuated by Gérald Trottier's masterpiece of Manna in Heaven, this floating above. It was casting shadows across the whole altar. Manna from Heaven was created of brazed metal with a bronze finish, and fortunately remains in place, thankfully. But unfortunately, alterations to the chapel, when it was repurposed as a bar with a surrounding loft level, lost a lot or many of these interior qualities. The space is deconsecrated, and of course, again, it could be easily used and restored as in an ecumenical role. So Murray's work was clearly impressive, and this was one of his early signature works of architecture in Ottawa. And we'll see that the architectural and historical values of the place should, of course, inspire the future of the site. And so goodbye. Only a decade later, the Campanile, with lack of support, declining number of novices, lack of funds within the separate school board, they hadn't been funded yet, and dwindling number of students, it was closed and sold, fortunately, to the federal government as a career development center for Transport Canada. There was, at the time, in fact, consideration of demolishing the whole complex and selling it for a new development. But in the end, the new trading center went ahead. And so from 1973 to its closure in 2012 or so, or a little bit before, it served federal training purposes. Tim Murray's design approach would, of course, continue to be explored in other churches, including the amazing St. Maurice Parish Church in Nepean on Meadowlands Drive. Fortunately, it survives and continues to serve its Catholic community. Unfortunately, other similar churches have not been preserved and reused. Edward Kuhatschis, another prominent Ottawa architect, designed St. Michael's and All Angels in 1965, only to have lost this modernist gem just a few years ago. And rather than retaining and integrating it into a more interesting townhouse project, it was not saved. The city approved the rezoning in 2021, but I digress from our project that we're talking about this evening. Now let's look at the designation and planning process. To give you context, the buildings in red are the ones now owned by Canada Lands Company, a development Crown Corporation. Their intentions are to demolish two of the buildings, H and I on the plan, which are designated buildings, or were designated buildings. So let's look at that process. There are a few challenges with federal heritage properties. Under the old FIBRO policy, buildings under 40 years of age or older were submitted to FIBRO for heritage evaluation. In this case, they were all designated as recognized federal heritage buildings and then listed on the Directory of Federal Heritage, the Directory of Federal Heritage Designations. Today, they'd be listed as a complex, but the threshold for designation is higher, meaning that there's essentially a discomfort by the federal government to designate. So they've raised the threshold to avoid more heritage designations. You won't find these buildings listed on a register anymore because they leave they leave the register when the ownership ceases to be with the federal government, and they're not designated anymore. So this is where there's poor transparency on the part of the federal government. They're essentially in limbo and mothballed by the owners until they are disposed of. This results in neglected and abandoned properties rather than offering a property in better condition to a private developer. Now, I don't recall discussions of covenants or easements on the property, which is in FIBRO's toolkit, or immediate designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. Generally, that's also an expectation by FIBRO. But just this past January, in fact, the City of Ottawa has finally listed the property on its register with an intent to designate. So with the provincial Ford government making it much harder to preserve our heritage with no informed knowledge of how heritage helps our sustainability goals, including to responding to the housing issues, the property needs to be listed on the municipal register with a notice of intention to designate before a planning application is submitted to the city by CLC. Finally, let's look at the future of the property and consider the demonstration of an infill at a historic place. Here are the Canada Land Company's primary goals for the new development, including a heritage conservation goal. And each of the proposed concepts had different zones. So part of it was location for stormwater, a future area for a potential school, and where the infill redevelopment areas be. In the end, the preferred option was a modified version of Concept 4. There would be an encircled road with demolition of the two original buildings, a taller building along Heron Road, infill housing at the rear with adjoining buildings to the former novice and nuns residences. There would also be additions to the former girls' gym and dorm. And between the new buildings to the north, there would be a green space linking to the parkland. There would also be a buffer zone beside Guildwood Estates called the Blue-Green Corridor. The Campanile buildings would remain with a clarity of their layout and form. The infill, not what I consider not fully in keeping with the ideas of the campus, would have several additions that may not be fully understood in relation to the existing campus. At a public consultation, there were considerations put forward on the values of heritage and meaning of the site. And it's interesting that they aligned well with the concepts of the 1960s. Many of them related on how personal experiences connect with the site, the buildings, and the landscape. And without delving too much into the ideas common in architectural design in the 1960s, the main idea is that once we enter the space, we can read it in terms of what is and is not there, meaning we can generate shapes from spaces, we can see geometrical elements independently of their position, or what we can perceive an overall organization outside of what we see because we are within this defined space. These are all concepts that rarely exist in the suburbs, except perhaps maybe with some of the townhouse developments of the 60s or 70s. Many of these ideas are English ideas that came out of the townscape movement. I won't go into that. What is interesting is that within the span of 2 consultations, those involved in the process became more engaged with the values of the place and how to retain them in the proposed new development. The summaries on heritage clearly shifted from negative in May 2021 to positive the following year. There were, of course, concerns in the community over the issue of height and density, particularly by Guildwood Estates and their single dwelling residents. In the latest round on intensification of the area, the neighboring community was in fact was for preservation of the campus, being adaptively reused as a retirement village or other use, before they realized that there would be intensification adjacent to their community, which then caused them much more concern, and this was to be when it was supposed to be in their backyard. Now, even in the 1960s, there were concerns over what was built in the suburbs. The idea that economic value of neighborhoods would be affected by the integration of mixed incomes, mixed communities, that can be hard to accept, just as hard as it is to accept heritage conservation as a concept. And this is a crossroad that bears mentioning, since we are often seeing these dynamics being played out in projects that may be beneficial to preserving heritage and yet abusing heritage as a means to an end, whether to support it or oppose it depending on your self-interest. So I think any one of us involved in heritage understands this situation. So the assumption by our provincial government, oddly enough, is that heritage advocates are the NIMBYists, and this is completely false. In this case, I include not only a 1960s headline, but also a headline from just a few weeks ago about the United Church's program to infill on their property where it has been delayed because 9 parking spaces weren't included, and there's worry by the community around it in Orleans. In the same consultation, there was identification of many material and visual attributes about the existing buildings. So there is this sort of sense of inventory here. But they may be more material that hasn't been released by Canada Lands Company, its consultants. But what has been offered doesn't really appear to me to be a conservation approach. Instead, it's essentially an inventory of character-defining elements. As all of you know by now, a heritage conservation plan can be one of the best ways to manage change at a historic place and actually enhance quality, condition, and maintenance of a site. So I'd like to end the presentation with profiling, in fact, Kathleen Chin's master's thesis that was completed at Carleton's School of Architecture under Mariana Sponda and Susan Ross. There's an uncanny similarity to what was proposed by CLC and its various concepts. Housing infill in the parking area, removal of the gym, bridge the chapel complex with a park corridor to the north. She proposed a slight variant with a parking garage north of the school and adding ground floor commercial to two of the buildings. What's important is that her thesis is much more driven by a conservation approach, using the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, which is not clearly laid out in the CLC proposal. Maybe it is, but it doesn't, the vision doesn't show that. In Kathleen's thesis, I think it's quite interesting, she presents her infill buildings from cues of other buildings. And so obviously she's applying standard 11 from the standards guidelines. As she wrote in her thesis, quote, "The design of each building plays off the proportions of the existing buildings, the material palette of light and dark brick in combination with concrete, and the tall, narrow windows found throughout the site." So we're still not sure beyond the massing and heights of what Canada Lands Company's final design, development design will be for the project. But in my case, I have some unsolicited recommendations. If there was a public conservation plan, a heritage conservation plan, focusing on the values of the whole place, we may see a slightly different plan. Retain the overall concept of the heritage values of the 60s concept with the interest in infill and intensification along Heron Road. Some recommendations would be to take housing concepts from the 60s and bring them into the project, while also introducing, I would suggest, a Wiener-styled street system, encouraging this idea of intimate courtyards, still respecting the axes of the property, and introduce commercial property facing Heron Road, but providing some underground parking there to eliminate parking in the site, and to link it to the theater, which hopefully will be a theater open to the public. So to wrap up, I have a few concluding points. While there is an effort to retain the heritage structures here, there remains some design questions on the additions in terms of compatibility with Murray's vision. I was impressed by the consultative process. It seems much better than most, with engagement and understanding of the community. And on a broader note, that heritage conservationists are addressing more projects that involve infills and additions. I think probably there should be some more guidance on conservation standards, both for additions and reuse of structures. I think that would benefit the field. And yet there's a poor system and accountability on the federal side when disposing of these federal heritage buildings. In this case, there is an intent to designate by the City of Ottawa, but a better approach to these projects is if the Crown corporations were accountable to the federal designations. They are not right now. On a personal note, as an architectural historian, the complex is truly a rare and impressive work of late modern design in Ottawa that fortunately has been preserved. I'm hoping that finally the theater will open to the public again, and I think would bring some more cultural dynamism to this suburban area. That said, Ottawa is in fact a very suburban city, and this needs to be rethought in terms of building and planning, especially with Bill 23 in mind. What we need to do is learn how to retain buildings while increasing density. We have a huge, what I think is a cognitive dissonance in practice. We still are over-emitting carbon because of our wealth and consumption, We're not preventing upsizing of houses in Ottawa suburbs. We see that all the time. Demolition, larger home, fewer people, or even a simple solution by the city of incorporating dedicated bike lanes. This is one of the simplest and cost-effective acts in any city. We've seen it around the world. What this project can be, I think, is an excellent example or potential example of how to redevelop a vacant site or an abandoned site with a sensitivity to heritage values, all the while offering more housing. Heritage and densification can work together in these projects and not as often perceived as an impediment. So I'd like to thank Heritage Ottawa for inviting me. Thank you for taking time out from your evening to listen to this talk. And I am open and welcome to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was incredibly interesting and such a wonderful, layered and nuanced unpacking, not only of the site itself and its qualities, but also of the process by which it came to be in the situation that it's now in. So Andrew has agreed to take questions, and I'll ask the audience to put your questions in the Q&A. It's starting to happen now, but I'll actually buy you some time to gather your thoughts and type your questions by starting with a question that occurred to me that really intrigued me. Something that I found really raised my eyebrows was the change in the support for retaining the heritage qualities of the place in the 1 year between the two consultations. And then it surprised me because initially, when there wasn't a lot of support, I thought, well, yeah, I mean, heritage of modern buildings is a tough sell for various reasons. People think that heritage has got to be old, even older than me. And so it didn't surprise me that much that the initial support was slow, but the increase in support over just 1 year is quite extraordinary. Do you have any idea what was at work there and how it is this turnaround happened?
I know some of the story behind it. I'm not sure if it's fully correct because I wasn't part of this process, but what I understand is that there were some, again, this consultative process allowed for people to engage with the project, and there were participatory sessions. So I think that's possibly part of it. I think that the fact that they did have a heritage consultant on board, they had ERA on board, and I suspect that there was allowance for presenting actually this aspect that often gets sidelined, but it was at the forefront. And I also think that the architect Tim Murray came to some of the presentations and or at least one presentation, and I think spoke. I'm not sure, but I suspect it's a combination of a few. It's interesting because value-based approach to conservation and to heritage is something that begins often, especially in North America, with a real resistance, and then eventually it starts to build its own value. It's almost like an inherent value that comes about. So probably over time, as one starts to appreciate these spaces and places and buildings for what they are, then you see this shift. The time frame was, yeah, I mean, I think CLT is doing a better job of engaging on these types of projects. We have the Booth Street Complex project, and we have other projects, but where the stakeholders are a huge range of people. They did have local students involved in some of the discussions. They had different parts of the community involved. So I suspect it's just because of the participation and also some of that engagement through the heritage consultants. I'm not completely sure why, but these are some of my notions behind it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that there'd be quite a few moving parts to it as well. It's a complex thing, but I mean, it is very encouraging. As you know, and as I think pretty many of the people in the audience will know, moving the needle in terms of heritage awareness can be a real slog. It can be really difficult. That's one of the reasons why Heritage Ottawa has to work so hard. And so it's very encouraging to see that the needle did move here. So I want to turn to some questions coming in from the audience. One of them is it possible to walk around any of the campus at this time or even around the perimeter?
I think so. I think you're able to at least walk around the site to some extent. I suppose there's security, but there was, unfortunately, during the years that when it was mothballed and abandoned, we did have some opportunities to go in and look at the site and tour the facility, and that was fortunate that we could do that at the time, and that was many years ago. I mean, the resiliency of the campus, even with it being mothballed, is really fascinating. I mean, yes, there's been some damage to it, but overall, the integrity of the place is quite high. So I mean, again, you're not looking at a complex of buildings that have been, mothballed for so long that they're deteriorated, which we call demolition by neglect. And in this case, we have a full opportunity to do some restoration work on some of these buildings and see what the potential is of it. I think it's a very exciting project. I think it's a very sensitive complex. I must say it's a rare complex in Canada, even some of these convent complexes. I didn't bring in some comparisons with other ones, but to answer the question, I think you can still engage with the site. You can experience some of this, even if it's abandoned, I think.
Thank you. I know what you mean about resilience. The chapel seems to have survived being a pub, so that's resilience.
Yeah.
Next question, and actually, I'm sort of, for brevity, I'm editing out the copious words of praise that are preceding most of these questions. Intensification will no doubt overwhelm the heritage nature of the campus. How strong is the movement to preserve?
Well, I may not fully understand the question, but that can happen. That is one of the risks. You have to manage these risks to, let's say, for infill projects. There are many ways to do this. It's not a scientific process. It's an artistic process, and that's where we're in that world of creativity, to how sensitively can we do this. I was very impressed by the master's thesis. I kind of enjoyed presenting that, because I thought there are ways to do these things sensitively. There are ways to build on the ideas that were actually quite innovative at the time. So yes, there may be concerns over some of the heights of these buildings, how the economics behind it are, what is the potential driver for a developer to come in and be profitable on it. Of course, my argument is always that if you had reduced incentives for other parts of our economy, and you had incentives for tax incentives for heritage buildings, then you would obviously tip the scale there, but we're still not there yet.
Yes, indeed.
Even locally, even with the city of Ottawa, they could bring in a tax incentive for developers for heritage buildings, but still hasn't happened.
Next, this one depends on your being familiar with another project. Having been a student at St. Pat's in the 80s, this is bringing back a lot of memories. The general layout of the proposed changes remind me quite a lot of the new Lupine complex of apartments in Kanata. Do you feel that this new complex may have inspired the St. Pat's changes? So, of course, answering that's dependent on your being familiar with the Lupine.
Yeah, I am not. So that's a wonderful question. Now you've piqued my curiosity. The Lupine complex. Okay, I have to look into that.
Something for us both to look up afterwards.
Yeah,
then.
yeah. I mean, some of the elements of the campus are just consistent with Ottawa. There's a strong roots in the place and the materials that were chosen. Obviously, I referred to the copper work is just, it's the part of the identity of this place. But even the brickwork and so on, these are all elements that are consistent with our vernaculars, whether they're modern vernaculars or historical. Murray is working with that language in this complex, and if we can see that rather than some of the less expensive materials, but more profitable, then we might get something that is quite interesting.
Great, thank you. You talked of possible reuse of the chapel for ecumenical worship or as a Buddhist temple. Given that a lot of other religious buildings are closing, what other uses for these redundant religious spaces could be possible?
Yeah, that is the question of the 21st century. What to do with places of worship, and how do we manage to retain them, possibly rehabilitate them in different ways? You know, that's a huge question with many answers. There's all sorts of opportunities and places. There's been very creative ways to do it around the world, particularly in, well, more closer to home in Quebec. They have the same situation happening. So rehabilitation can, I think some of these modern, especially the post-Vatican II spaces, are actually quite flexible. You would be able to do some of the values that were there during the design of it could be rehabilitated or restored, and then still have a different function. That was a throw out to the temple, because I noticed they're on a major fundraising campaign for the Buddhist temple. Now, I did notice that, you know, manna from heaven has lost its Christ figure that was hanging down. It's gone, and I don't know. Maybe Denise Trottier knows where it is, but there is a way to rehabilitate these places, but keep the values of the place while changing functional programs and use. That's possible. I mean, unfortunately, in the 70s, the federal government, the Department of Public Works at the time, sent out a lot of contracts to alter the space inside, and you saw the impacts of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting issue. And for some reason, when I was reading the question, the words St. Bridget's popped into my brain.
Exactly. Yeah, St. Bridget's is an interesting case. I mean, there's many options. There's sensitive ones, there's sublime ones, there's ridiculous ones.
Yeah, we've seen some of each. Now, here's a question that certainly crossed my mind during your talk. Might it be possible to arrange for a guided tour?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's in Canada Lands Company's hands. I did give a tour at the National Trust Conference pre-pandemic when they were in Ottawa. I think we took out a group of people and thoroughly loved going through the building. I mean, it is a bit of a time piece right now. All of the things that were there during the federal study center years, it's abandoned and left in there. I think the phones are even still there, and the furniture and the beds are half made and things like that. So but yes, I mean, who wouldn't want to have? I think some people did for the consultation process. I believe there were some on-site opportunities, which I think was really helpful. I think that's useful. But wow, if we could get this back into an opportunity to open it up a little, people would really appreciate it. I think actually the theater is a very impressive theater, and where cultural spaces are lacking in places, or even in the 1970s when they were hoping to have school plays, all the schools were full, and so they didn't have enough space. And in fact, I've got quotes from the Department of Public Works saying, unfortunately, due to policy reasons, we're unable to share this space with anyone else. So it's a classic federal answer.
Yes, due to policy reasons, which means the curtain's going down. There's no point in getting too worked up. Actually, an elaboration, a comment related to that has been posted. Yes, the public can walk around the perimeter. As part of CLC's consultation process, there was a tour of the campus with the community. So at least there's that. There's access to the grounds. And Certainly a tour would be wonderful. And if they still have their phones, I would love to take my students there, show them what a landline looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yes, that's right.
Can you give us a sense of the surrounding neighborhoods? Is there any retail or other commercial component nearby? To what extent could the project be woven into the surrounding neighborhoods?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these types of complexes in terms of I mean, it's not a homogeneous space. There's the Heron Mall, and unfortunately that was all demolished and then it was rebuilt. But there's public housing, there's townhouses around the area. There's the typical there's the lack of a high street. It's all suburban planning from the 1940s and 50s. I mean, it's not even a Ratburn plan approach. It's a very decentralized, low density area with large roads, fully car dependent. Most streets don't even have sidewalks in these neighborhoods because, and in fact, they resisted sidewalks in the 60s. They didn't want people walking around. So it's there is a mix, but it's a tough sell. And full disclosure, we used to live in Alta Vista, so I mean, we know what the experience of living a suburban lifestyle is. Yeah, but these do exist in places. These kind of townhouse developments. In fact, I showed a slide from the 1960s of innovations. There was huge innovations in Canada to balance, and they should be revived if we have this housing issue, because the same situation happened in the 1960s where an influx of people were coming into Canada. They wished to have their own private house. They weren't willing to live in the towers, the slab block towers in suburbs. So townhouses were a brilliant balance, and there were many architects doing really innovative designs in townhouse communities, those villages with private roads and so on. That was very familiar. Yeah, Norbert Schoenauer and others were interested in that.
Thank you. Excellent presentation on a surprisingly complex modern site. Now, I would echo that, both the excellence and the layers of complexity and memory and cultural DNA encoded in it was really quite exceptional. You mentioned that Crown corporations aren't currently beholden to federal conservation processes. Seems like an opportunity lost for our federal caretakers. Do you think that's a gap in process that needs to be addressed?
Well, it's a gap in process, but it's also a gap in policy and legislation. I mean, the parliamentary committee probably 6 years ago or so recommended that all Crown corporations be subject to the same policies and conservation and heritage policies that are applied to each of the departments. The only one that does fall under, and I think it's voluntary, is the National Capital Commission. Otherwise, all of the other Crown corporations are not subject to any. They are not subject to provincial legislation, municipal legislation, or federal legislation. They are basically entities unto themselves with no they aren't beholden to anyone. They can make their own decisions. So it's a huge gap. The number of Crown Corporation owned buildings is gradually being reduced. CBC selling off much of their property. Canada Post has done the same. So there's a lot of buildings, but that are missing in this protective environment under, and the intention of Bill C-23, not to be confused with Bill 23, is that they were to be included, and they do have a schedule, and it includes the National Capital Commission, but it doesn't have any other Crown corporations in it. Yes, I think you can do it in Ontario. You can put listings, schedules of buildings on a list. Ontario Place used to be on that list, places like that, that you can do this. It's not difficult to do. It's just the political will and intentions. That's all.
Yeah, it is. It is extraordinary. And I remember when there was controversy flaring about the proposed addition of the Chateau Laurier, and some of the people who were opposed to it were demanding that the federal government buy it, they acquire it. But of course, I thought, if you really are concerned about protecting a building's heritage, federal government ownership is one of the worst things you could wish on it, because there simply isn't any accountability there at all.
Well, there is for departments, and there is a concerted effort to maintain them. You know, there's, again, the most notable buildings, the most monumental buildings get the most attention, and especially in the National Capital Region. But yeah, I mean, it's the government owns, as I showed in my pre-slide, you know, the government owns about 40,000 buildings. They own much more land and property, but they own about 40,000 buildings, and a minuscule amount are designated. It's just there's the will to designate is not really there. That's my argument for existing buildings, is that why don't we get beyond the idea of designation and go to a place where Department of National Defense maintains all their buildings, or all these people maintain them, and then they're very attractive when you put them on the market because they're maintained. They're not mothballed and falling apart or ignored. Many other countries are already on the bandwagon of saying no more demolition. The UK is ahead of us. Even the United States is ahead of us. Demolition is something we really kind of enjoy doing. It's something that, and there's tax reasons for that. There's income tax reasons. There's incentives to demolish. I mean, you just have to, I'm sure Mark Dennis has spoken about this many times. So it's a situation that it could save us a huge amount of carbon and meet our climate targets if the shift in thinking was there. So.
Yes, I certainly see what you mean. Next, fabulous presentation, Andrew. What role do you think research plays in bringing the value of sites home? A lot of these modern sites aren't appreciated because their intentions and the theory behind them is not understood. And of course, that's one of the things in the first section of your talk so beautifully, is you unpacked all that. And it would be impossible to see that and not think, oh yeah, we've got something really special here. So what role?
Oh, I mean, that is the core, and that's the understanding part of these places, is to understand them, is to appreciate them. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of interpretation on modern structures, modern heritage, whatever you want to call it, today. I mean, it's actually, Canada produced a vast number. Most of our construction is post World War II, when thousands and thousands of architects were trained in modernist schools of architecture. And it's somewhat odd that, you know, decades and decades later, and with a revival actually of a neo-modernist aesthetic, and again, I mean, that people haven't really embraced all the ideas of modernism, especially their spatial components and breaking out from the traditional forms and so on. And it's fascinating because they aren't particularly modern anymore. They're quite historic in a way, but people still have a challenge. They often what happens is that there's not enough you know, almost like public access or public history to this era, and yet it defined Canada. There's been work on, you know, centennial architecture and so on, but it really is, the emergence of Canada is in modern architecture. I mean, I present on new brutalism all the time, and again, very young people in classes really appreciate the expression of brutalism. There's a whole generation of people experience brutalism, and they're not too too keen on it. But it's kind of fascinating. Once you explain these ideas, these concepts behind it, and we walk around the site, then they realize, oh, I hadn't realized this. The amount of psychology behind it, the amount of phenomenology behind it. I mean, the amount of, and actually they're quite beautiful. I mean, people would have loved Trent University, for instance. That's a campus that has similar ideas to what Tim Murray was doing with this historic campus and relationship. People go to Trent University and they thoroughly love it. So it's a way, it's a challenge to interpreting it. I know that there are people that really appreciate Jim Strutt's work in Ottawa. There's been concerted efforts to sort of preserve his work. Not a lot of people understand the math behind Jim Strutt's work. There's all these subtle mathematical relationships, which are they were pioneering at the time. Ottawa does have some very good places, but they're just not even brought out into the public realm. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add that research is important, but of course, so is dissemination and communication.
Exactly, yeah.
Of course, that's what we're doing tonight. That's largely what Heritage Ottawa does. Another reason to support Heritage Ottawa and become a member.
Well, every architectural firm that's working on a historic building should have an architectural historian on not just an architect who's working with the design features, but have an architectural historian who's understanding history, the concepts of history, how they apply to a place, relationships between the past and the present and the future. I mean, these and you can see it. I've seen it in firms where you do have this kind of research happening, and Massey Hall is a good example in Toronto of the work they did there. A lot of that was inspired by someone who's an architectural historian who did the research.
Yep, absolutely. Got a question, interesting question about related to manna from heaven. Denise Trottier has been very active in speaking about preserving her father's work. Have you been in touch with her beyond manna from heaven? There were other items that were designed for the chapel. So what is there, do you know?
Well, unfortunately, with all my schedule, I mean, I have been in touch with Denise before about a related Gérald Trottier crucifix, but in fact, that would be part of this understanding component, is that we don't know where maybe some of these pieces have gone. I don't know if they're back with the Catholic Church, or I don't know. I mean, again, it's just I wouldn't know. But Denise has been very supportive and also very vocal about trying to maintain Trottier's importance in Ottawa. Again, an unheralded part of Ottawa is the amount of artists that had integrated works into their architecture. Again, overlooked oftentimes. There's a generation of architects who were, or not architects, I'm sorry, artists who were sculptors or relief makers and so on, who integrated their artworks into buildings. And you know, they're overlooked. It's what sometimes is called sort of the missing elements that they see them, and they're sometimes quite subtle. They could be glazed brickwork, as you see in the Jackson building downtown Ottawa, or there's all these artists who are also working with them. And of course there was a public art program at the time for the federal government, but there's also integrated artworks into these places, and I think they're just as a value. You know, oftentimes we just divorce the two from each other, but in fact they were a significant integration, and that is a somewhat of a hallmark in modern architecture, because they're coming out of this functionalist school of architecture. They want to integrate artistic elements into their buildings, so they start using concrete in different ways, or doing relief sculptures, or these sort of modernist works out of very noble materials, metals, and so on.
Now, there's actually an absolutely wonderful Trottier mosaic at Carleton in the Tory building.
That's right, the Tory building.
I'll tweet a picture of it and tag Heritage Ottawa later tonight.
Fabulous, and that's an interesting project in itself when they did that. Yeah.
What is the timeline for redevelopment and approval for this site?
I have no idea. I mean, to be honest, I have no idea where it goes from here. The master plan was released. I think there's discussions with the city. I think there'll be an application, development application going in at some point. Who will be interested in doing the work? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it evolves. But no, I don't know what the rest of the schedule's like. No. I think other. I mean, I'm again, I don't work for Canada Lands Company, and I'm not the project manager for it. So, but I'm sure that they're moving forward with it. Yeah.
Okay, we've got more vigorous support for a tour. A comment, Bill C-23 is currently being debated in Parliament. Hopefully it is passed with the proposed amendments recommended by the heritage community. There will be suitable protection for federally owned and crown buildings. CLC have been doing this to some extent without legislative support. So kudos to them for that.
Yeah, and CLC has across the country done sensitive work. I mean, I'm not outing anyone here. It's just the process behind it. Bill C-23 really only addresses a very small number of properties in Canada that are owned on federal lands. It does do some housekeeping for our legislative framework. It takes things out of policies and puts them into law. So there will be some accountability, hopefully. There are proposed amendments. There is a group working on that to try to encourage, and it just, in fact, it just went on Tuesday. I was told that on Tuesday there was a very short tabling on second reading, and I don't think they had time to debate it, but yeah, it's a start. It's a start for Canada. Many other countries are light years ahead of us, but maybe we're at the point where we'll realize that this is actually beneficial for everyone. It's a bit of a no-brainer. I think, fortunately, they have all party support for it, so maybe it's a start. It's a very modest start, but it's a start.
You got time for a couple more questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm concerned about the number of people that are just on here, but
yeah. I guess those who can stick around will.
Okay.
Here's an interesting question about adaptive reuse. You mentioned one of the proposals was geared to seniors care. Would a senior hub not be most compatible with the heritage characteristics and maybe even historical vocation of the site?
Yeah, that was an interesting proposal that I think early on one of the communities said, well, if it is a health, I think even the University of Ottawa's healthcare, I think they were interested in discussions with the site and possible usage, but as the need as an aging population, if there was some opportunity to do that kind of thing, I think that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I think it actually works quite well with I mean, they are residences. They don't have many facilities in the room. They're quite small rooms. I mean, this was for the Catholic Church there was a certain austerity to them, but possibly there'd be an option to do that. Yeah, I think that's an opportunity to deal with the housing of seniors.
Okay.
Might be some accessibility issues that we'd have to deal with, but
right.
I mean, the underground corridors are fabulous because then everyone can connect and they can have a library, and I mean, there's potential. There's all sorts of potential.
Sure, and of course, arguably, the accessibility issues should be dealt with whatever the future use of the
exactly. Building. Yeah, above and beyond.
But here's a question. Who will use the heritage buildings, for example, the chapel and the theater, since there's no visitor parking identified on the proposed plan? Is that a big barrier to their usefulness?
Yeah, I don't know. I thought in my last few slides, I thought because it is still a car culture, you'll need some access to parking on the site. And same with Kathleen Chin had proposed 2 parking garages, actually. There's still a car-centric, approach to these areas. So we need to have some parking, at least in the near future with the development. But I think having that would allow for, say, if there was one of the theater companies or a mixed use of it, that they'd be able, I suggested a connection straight through to the theater, sort of along the lines of those underground passageways, so that you could turn in, park, and go to your favorite play that's being performed, or a music performance. It's there's a few schools around the area, like Hillcrest and so on, and Canterbury, that have auditoriums, but or auditoria. But there could be more. There could be this. The theater is actually very intimate. It's a really, it's a sunken theater. It is a full range of views from it. It's a thrust stage. I mean, it would be perfect for any company of fools, for instance, or something, could use it in the off season, right? I mean, it could be an opportunity to have a really interesting cultural. But yes, the challenge is it's out there. It's on Heron Road. It's, you know, there's only one means to get there, really. There I think there is a bus line. I think there is proposals by the city with their plans to, I think in the official plan, to create a rapid bus route at some point down Heron Road. But it is, you know, there are some challenges there. But I think these spaces could be reused and, you know, rehabilitated for, well, not even that. The theater is completely intact. I mean, all it has to do is sweep it up and open it up, and I'm sure it'd be perfectly fine.
Great.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, I think I've got to wrap it up there.
Yeah.
Apologies if I didn't get to your question, or if you didn't get time to post a question. Please feel free to email additional questions
And I
to
can answer.
To Heritage Ottawa, info at heritageottawa.org, and we will pass the questions on to our speaker. But I do need to wrap it up and let everyone get on with their evenings and on with their lives. So thank you again, Andrew. That was a wonderful talk, and we could have gone on all night, but really, really fascinating stuff, and so beautifully presented with such richness and texture and nuance. It was really, really quite fantastic.
Well, thank you.
And thank you again to our audience. Thank you for joining us. You're the reason we do this. Please get back to us if you have any feedback. As I said before, if you liked what you saw, if you found this stimulating, if you want to continue to be part of this sort of conversation, then please consider joining Heritage Ottawa and becoming part of the community that addresses these issues on a regular basis. And our next presentation will be April 26th, and in French. Claude Royer will summarize our last 3 English lectures on the Alexander Bridge and bring us up to date on that subject rather. And online registration is required and is available on the Heritage Ottawa website. And as I mentioned, please consider supporting us on an ongoing basis so we can keep meeting like this again and again. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.